You know, we hear about oil and geopolitics all the time, but what if that's all just a distraction? Today, we're digging into a really compelling theory that says a secret war for a different and maybe more critical resource has already kicked off. And according to this theory, the first shots were fired just a few days ago. Okay, let's get right into this. The source we're looking at lays out an incredibly dramatic few days. It all starts on January 1st with a regulatory bombshell out of Beijing. Then, just 48 hours later, a pretty stunning U.S. military strike down in South America. And by the 5th, global markets are in absolute chaos. So how do all these pieces fit together? Let's break it down. Now, the official story that you probably heard on the news was all about removing a criminal regime and securing oil supplies. But the source material we're examining today makes a very powerful claim that whole story was just a carefully built narrative to hide the real objective, a much, much bigger and more strategic prize. So, let's start with the event that really lit the fuse here, a high-risk U.S. military operation on January 3rd, 2026. The codename was Operation Southern Spear. According to the source, this was an incredibly fast, precision strike. We're talking about elite units from the Joint Special Operations Command, think Delta Force, hitting the absolute nerve center of the Venezuelan military and the presidential palace at the same time. And in just a matter of hours, the government was basically paralyzed, and President Maduro himself was captured. Now, the source uses this specific term, kinetic action, to describe what happened. And that's important because it highlights that this wasn't some quiet cyber attack or a diplomatic mission. No, this was direct, physical, military force. Officially, the whole thing was framed as a fight against narco-terrorism, a move to restore democracy. The U.S. even used some unsealed indictments to give it a legal justification. But the source argues that the really crucial point here is the timing. Why then? Why take such a huge risk? Well, the answer, it claims, wasn't in Caracas at all. It was in Beijing. And that right there brings us to the very core of this whole theory. To really get the motive behind that military strike, the source says you have to rewind just 48 hours to something that happened on New Year's Day. On January 1st, China set off what the source calls a silent bomb. It wasn't a missile, it was a piece of paper, a regulatory move. They suddenly slapped these aggressive new export controls on silver, a metal that is absolutely critical for all sorts of high-tech manufacturing. And this sent an immediate shockwave all the way through the global supply chain. And we're not talking about a small adjustment here. This move effectively put a gatekeeper on 121 million ounces of refined silver every single year. Suddenly, Beijing was in a position to decide who gets this critical metal and who doesn't. The theory here is that this was a huge strategic power play. Sure, it was partly retaliation for U.S. sanctions on things like semiconductors, but the bigger reason was to lock down the enormous amounts of silver that China needs for its own massive solar panel and electric vehicle industries, what they called their green leap forward. And this is where it all comes together. This is where those two seemingly separate events, the China shock and the Venezuela strike, collide. The argument is that the U.S. operation wasn't just a coincidence. It was a direct and maybe even desperate response to China trying to corner the silver market. You can see the two competing stories laid out right here, side by side. The official narrative was all about oil, drugs, and democracy. But the source we're looking at claims the real motives were totally different: securing silver, countering China's growing control over resources, and, well, seizing a critical national asset by force. So what was the real prize? Not just the oil fields. It was this, the Arco Minero del Orinoco. We're talking about a massive territory, bigger than a lot of countries actually, that is just packed with gold, diamonds, and, most importantly, silver. The source frames this as the largest untapped resource in the entire Western Hemisphere, which the U.S. suddenly decided it had to control before it was too late. By the way, if you're finding this explainer valuable, a quick like, share, or subscribe really does help us out, and it makes sure you won't miss any of our future updates. Okay, now let's get back to it and look at the financial fallout from all this, which, according to the theory, was immediate and pretty severe. So you've got this supply shock from China and the demand shock from the Venezuela situation hitting at the same time. It created a perfect storm. And the source claims this 1-2 punch didn't just shake up the silver market, it completely broke the paper market that sets the price. To really understand why the market broke, you have to look at this number from the COMEX exchange, which is one of the main places silver is traded. It was, well, a system built on a very shaky foundation. For every single ounce of real, physical silver sitting in their vaults, there were 356 paper contracts, all claiming to own that exact same ounce. It's a house of cards, just waiting for a good push. And that push came. The source describes what is basically a classic run on the bank. First, the geopolitical shock just shattered trust in the system. Then, investors started to panic, and they didn't want a cash payout, they wanted the actual physical metal. And that's when they discovered the vaults were nearly empty, after years of inventories being drained away. Now, what made this price surge so different was that it was what the source calls a double-engine event. You see it broken down here. On one side, you had this huge industrial demand from sectors like solar and electric cars that just has to have silver. And on the other, you had a flood of monetary demand from people just looking for a safe place to put their money, all of it amplified by this new fear of global conflict. Finally, the source argues that all of these events have pushed us into a new and frankly pretty dangerous era for everybody, an era that fundamentally changes the rules of global finance. And it calls this new reality empire risk. So what is that? Well, it's the danger that the world's most dominant power can just decide to rewrite the rules, seize another country's assets by force, and in doing so, prove that no asset held within that dollar-based system is ever really safe from a political decision. And the consequences of this, the theory argues, are just huge. As you can see, silver is no longer just a precious metal. It's now a strategic one. Nations are supposedly scrambling to get their physical gold and silver out of foreign vaults and bring it all back home. But the biggest consequence, the one that really affects all of us, is that trust in the entire financial system, it starts to crack. So the ultimate takeaway from this whole theory is this. We are right at the beginning of what it calls a silver supercycle. It's a fundamental repricing of the metal, and it's being driven by two powerful forces, the unstoppable demand from new technology on one side and the raw fear of global conflict on the other. And that really brings us to the final, and I think very provocative question that the source leaves us all with. In a world where financial rules can just be rewritten by military force overnight, what really makes any asset truly safe?